I begin every year with ambitious, often quite restrictive reading plans in mind. It's an odd and somewhat puritanical streak in me that drives the ritual, but I invariably find that no sooner have I made the reading plans than I break them. Perhaps for me, the ritual consists in the breaking itself, and in the pleasure of finding myself once again on that endless, flowering path of new literary discoveries. So I thought I'd share some of this year's with you. As with last year, I've limited this list to books that I read for the first time in 2023. It's also limited exclusively to fiction, and I had in mind books that I'd be interested in returning to at some point in the future. Please feel free to leave your end-of-year lists in the comments. I always really love seeing what you've been reading and finding new and wonderful things to discover. There are certain writers whose imaginations are particularly outlandish, drawing meaning and beauty out of the most bizarre, arcane constellations of objects and circumstances, constructing a vision of the world that, to use R.P. Blackmore's famous phrase, adds to the stock of available reality. This year, the world lost one such imagination. On the 3rd of March 2023, Kenzaburo Oe passed away. He defined himself as a writer of the periphery, a term which he meant to have both geographical and philosophical import, and to characterize the peculiarity of his imagination. In an interview of 1999 at Berkeley, Oe had this to say.
I was born in a small island, I said that. With Japanese, and our Japan is a periphery in the Asia. That is a very important thing. Our very eminent colleagues of Japan believes in Japan is a center of Asia, and even they think secretly Japan is the center of the world. So I always say that I am the writer of the periphery district and periphery Japan of Asia and periphery country of this planet. With proud, I say that the literature must be written from the periphery towards the center, and we can criticize the center, and also our hero or our theme or our imagination is that of peripheral human being. So the man who is in the center have not to write anything. And from the periphery, we can write the story of the human being, and this story can express the humanity of the center. When I say the word periphery, this is the most important creed of mine.
When the news of Oe's death reached me, I immediately stopped what I was reading at the time and picked up my copy of The Silent Cry from 1967. I hadn't yet read it, but I knew that it was regarded as one of Oe's most seminal works. I already had a deep admiration for his collection of novellas, Teach Us to Outgrow Our Madness, and particularly the story The Day He Himself Shall Wipe My Tears Away, which I found incredibly moving. The bleak, absurd tone of The Silent Cry is set from its very opening. The novel begins in Tokyo with the narrator, Mitsaburo, attempting to come to terms with his best friend's suicide. His friend had painted his head red, pushed a cucumber into his anus, and hanged himself. Mitsaburo's wife is gradually descending into alcoholism after the pair abandoned their disabled child. From this already decayed state, they make the decision to move back to the village in Shikoku, where Mitsaburo grew up. What is hoped will be a fresh start becomes in effect a further descent into a state of increasingly irreparable decay. I have to confess that The Silent Cry is one of the more challenging books that I read this year. It's dense symbolism and cultural specificity at times made aspects of it quite difficult to absorb. As the book proceeds, various narrative and historical strands are introduced. Negotiations with Jin, once touted in national newspapers as Japan's fattest woman, Mitsaburo's firebrand brother and his organization of a cult following among the youth of the village, the disputed memory of a peasant uprising in 1860, in which the protagonist's family played a significant and perhaps ignominious role, historical tensions between Japan and Korea, the mysterious circumstances around the death of the sibling's older brother. All of these elements are woven together into a tangled fabric of associations whose weight pushes Mitsaburo closer and closer to the brink of oblivion. What I admired most in the book, alongside this strange and complex symbolic mapping of national and personal history, was the backdrop against which it's all set. Oe allows the landscape of rural Shikoku, and particularly the forest, the home of monsters in regional folklore, to emerge as a conflicted image in the book, its influence sinister and sublime. At night, I told myself, the sky would close in on the vast forest as tightly as the shell of an abalone enfolds its flesh. The thought that this road we were traversing through the heart of the forest was slowly decaying struck home with a dull, unpleasant shock somewhere at the back of my mind. I felt the eye of the forest staring at me from among cedars, pines, and several species of cypress, all of a green so murky that one perceived it almost as black. Based on a true story is a strange phrase to apply to a work of fiction. The gap between reality and fiction is necessarily limitless. It can dilate like a pupil to encompass more than may be immediately apparent. One of John Banville's narrators states that truth is closed and inert, while lies ramify in endless, unexpected directions. The Mexican writer Fernanda Melchor, in 2017's hurricane season, skirts this border between reality and fiction. The text is based on a real crime, but by choosing a fictional expression, Melchor is able to direct her gaze beyond the particulars of the deed, to behold instead the darkling void out of which they emerged. In an interview during the 2020 Edinburgh International Book Festival, Melchor described the origins of the book and her decision to write it in the form of fiction.
I'm a journalist too, and a few years ago I read in the newspaper this story, a small story about a village witch that had been found dead, murdered in a canal. It just fascinated me, the fact that the journalists, the authorities, the police, they all accepted the fact that this person was a witch. Of course, I was also shocked that these things still happen in 21st century, right? At first, I tried to write a nonfiction story, sort of in cold blood by Truman Capote. I wanted to go there and do research and interview the murderers and go visit them in prison, the whole package, the whole new journalist package. But it was too dangerous to do that in that time in Mexico, with the drug dealing violence and practically a war between different cartels. I also felt that I didn't have any right to go there and ask questions and expect to get the truth from those questions, to people that I didn't even knew, that I didn't even know. I just thought that maybe I could do a work of fiction and through fiction get to some kind of truth behind this horrendous act and make sense of this horrible violence that seemed at that time to be around me all the time.
The form the novel takes is a series of breathless and hectic monologues, each of them humming with violence, both latent and manifest. A series of voices catalogue an environment drowning in poverty, sexual abuse, drugs and alcohol, misogyny. Narratives intersect, contradict one another, tumble in waves of violence, whirl madly like the titular hurricane around the central act of murder and the disposal of the body of the so-called witch, a disputed act at the eye of the storm. It wasn't until the novel's final act that it really began to have its impact on me. Brando's narrative, in particular, a story of repressed homosexuality in an environment drenched with displays of masculine dominance and brutality, was particularly powerful. Brando's transformation as he penetrates deeper and deeper into depravity is drawn extraordinarily well.
Lord, what have I done to deserve this child? Where's my darling boy, my sweet, dear little Brando? How could you allow the devil to enter him, Lord? The devil doesn't exist, he'd shout back, or your shitty God. And his mother would let out an anguished wail followed by more prayers, intoned with even greater intensity, even greater devotion, to make up for her son's blasphemies, before Brando stormed off to the bathroom where he'd stand before the mirror and stare at the reflection of his face until it looked like his black pupils, together with his equally black irises, had dilated so wide that they covered the entire surface of the mirror, a forbidding darkness cloaking everything.
There's also a chilling encounter at the very end of the novel in the witch's now empty house, with a kind of distillation of evil that really made the book for me. It's one that has received a huge amount of praise, but its swirling chaos left me reeling and eager to explore the rest of her translated work. Gothic doesn't always mean horror. Sometimes it breathes through a book's temperament without being expressed directly. One senses it at the corners of fictional spaces, in the darkness that lies just beyond the well-illumined frame of realism. This is very true of the short novel The Vet's Daughter by Barbara Cummins. The book is narrated by a young girl, Alice, who grows up in a South London home, ruled over brutally by her veterinarian father. From the outset of the book, one feels charmed by Alice, by the colourful concision of her expression, and the vitality of her imagination, which seems at once invigorated and dampened by the horrid circumstances in which she finds herself. Her abusive father is a cheapskate, a drunkard, and a braggart whose disregard for anything other than his own pleasure or advancement drains the life, quite literally in one instance, out of the household. Alice's reality ultimately amounts to a navigation of male influence. She is brutalized, fawned over, or disappointed by every man that she encounters. It is in her rich internal life that the magic of the book emerges. It becomes for her a place of retreat.
Sometimes the life I was living seemed so hopeless and sad. I would try to imagine I was in another world. Then all the dreary brown things in the kitchen would turn into great exotic flowers, and I'd be in a kind of jungle. And when the parrot called from his lavatory prison, he wasn't the parrot, but a great white peacock crying out. I would see enormous leaves, almost black against a blazing sky, and the sun shining between them like golden swords, and I could hold out my hands and feel the warmth.
I'm somewhat hesitant to say too much here, but later in the novel, Alice's internal magicking of the world finds external expression. This world-shaping, imaginative act, which in a sense always feels like the desire to escape, is translated into a supernatural ability that can be read perhaps as a direct manifestation of that very desire. This sudden shift into a supernatural register might be a little jarring for some, but in my opinion, It's there throughout the book, hauntingly apparent, just off stage. I often admire writers who are steeped in their native region, who are able to draw out of the mundane and the particular, the transcendent and the universal. I've long admired Thomas Hardy, for instance, at least in part for this very reason. Mary Webb has inspired comparisons to Hardy, certainly because of this quality. The book I want to talk about here, Precious Spain from 1924, was recommended to me by Quinton S. Crisp, a writer whom I admire enormously, and it was a very well-placed recommendation. The book is a dark rural romance set in the early 19th century. It deals with the Sarns, a Shropshire family with, as the narrator puts it, lightning in their blood. The male line is of a stern and sullen temperament. Prue Sarn, the narrator, is born with a cleft palate, or, as it is often expressed in the book, she is hair-shotten, regarded as cursed by some, as a witch by others. Throughout the book, she must navigate her harsh lot, her relationships with her brutal father, and her increasingly parsimonious and unforgiving brother, Gideon. In some ways, Mary Webb could be seen as even more thoroughly steeped in her region than Thomas Hardy. One of the great pleasures of the book is that its narrator makes liberal use of the Shropshire dialect and recounts many fascinating and usually lost folk customs, such as the love spinning, nocturnal funerals, bull baiting, and perhaps the most interesting of all, sin eating. At Shropshire funerals, it was customary to hire so-called sin eaters, men who would take upon their own souls the sins of the dead.
Sin eaters were such as had been wise men or layers of spirits and had fallen on evil days, or they were poor folk that had come through some dark deed out of the kindly life of men, and with whom none would trade, whose only food might oftentimes be the bread and wine that had crossed the coffin. He would take bread and wine handed to him across the coffin, and eat and drink, saying, I give easement and rest now to thee, dear man, that ye walk not over the fields nor down the byways, and for thy peace I pawn my own soul.
In the novel, it is Gideon who takes on his father's sins.
Is there a sin eater?
We didn't send for one. Gideon forbade it.
I'll do it.
No, Gideon. No. Sin eaters are cursed.
What harm is there to sup me own wine? Or eat a crumb of me own bread? But if you dunna care, Mother, let it be. He can go with his sins on him.
No.
I should add that there's a lot of sweetness and tenderness in this book to offset the darkness of its narrative. This is particularly apparent in the luscious evocation of the Shropshire landscape, and in Prue Sarn's attention to the beauty of small marvels, such as the metamorphosis of a dragonfly, which becomes a metaphor in the book for the transformation of her own character.
Already the skin over its bright, flaming eyes was as thin as glass, so that you could see them shining like coloured lamps. In a little, the old skin split, and it got its head out. Then began the rustling and the travail to get free. First its legs, then its shoulders and soft, wrinkled wings. It was like a creature possessed, seeming to fall into a fit times, and times to be struck stiff as a corpse. Just afore the end, it stayed a long while stiff, as if it was wondering whether it durst get quite free in a world all new. Then it gave a great heave and a kind of bursting wrench, and it was out.
Last year I read quite a number of Brendan Connell's books, and although I slowed down somewhat this year and only read 2, 2016's Clark really stood out among his already quite extraordinary bibliography. The book concerns a Paraguayan actor, stage name Eric Clark, who receives a visitation in the early hours of the morning in a New York hotel room. A figure appears above him and offers him the gift of talent. The narrative then follows Clark's rise in the Italian film industry as he devotes himself, usually with high seriousness, to roles in an endless series of often slipshod B-movie productions. I confess to being largely unfamiliar with the world in which this novel is set, the world of giallo cinema and spaghetti westerns and so on, but it strikes me that the book is written from a place of huge affection for these films, and also with deep knowledge of them. And I'm certain that anybody who is familiar with them would gain an extra level of enjoyment. What stood out for me, however, as it often does in Connell's books, was the exuberance of the style. At times, Clark borrows, fascinatingly, the language of cinema, employing montage, jump cuts, dissolves. Its narrative is interspersed with invented film reviews, excerpts from screenplays, fragments of interviews with directors, footnotes detailing production notes. Its core narrative is spliced together with spools of such filmic collage and ephemera. I'd originally planned to discuss what I thought of as Connell's malleable style in the novel, only to find that my friend Sean, a magnificent reviewer who goes under the name of Culture Cat, had already applied precisely this term. He describes this chameleonic element of Connell's work brilliantly, and better than I ever could, saying, "There's a really interesting facet to Connell's writing in that the prose can be very malleable in regards to style. At any moment the narrative will be intruded upon by an entirely different register, such as bullet-pointed lists, 16 ways cowboys die by gunfire, or the filmic grammar and layout of the screenplay. The narrative is prone to stop, then replay the last sentences from a different perspective, almost like a filmic retake of a scene. The prose can also slip into an impressionistic register, reminiscent of modernist poetry." I'll leave a link to Sean's full review in the description. In general, I really recommend following Culture Cat's blog and his social media. You'll be sure to make some discoveries. There's also an emotional depth to Clark that, in my experience, Connell often shies away from in his work, generally preferring to maintain an ironic distance from his characters. The emphasis on what may be lost in the life of an artist in service to the art, and the monomania of the artistic pursuit itself, comes quite powerfully to the fore at certain points in the book. There are spells of disillusionment, struggles with artistic failure, and a profound loss of identity. This is apparent during the chapter in which Clark returns home to Paraguay. He wanted to see his father, to see again the place he had been born, which still came to him in his dreams. Something fascinating, enticing, awful, like a womb or a graveyard he had come out of, some primordial place where the ghosts of his ancestors dwelled alongside the ghost of his childhood, which seemed to be there, staring at him from out of the past. When he got off the plane in Asunción, he was amazed at the sorry state of the airport. What had seemed large now seemed small. What had appeared splendid now seemed ragged. His father was old and welcomed him sadly. The actor hardly recognized this man whose withered face was lost behind a giant white moustache. The discovery of Gordon Byrne has been quite a revelation to me this year. I documented my reading of Happy Like Murderers in a reading diary earlier in the year, and I have to say it's easily become one of the most powerful reading experiences of my life. And I may have more to say about this if I manage to make an end-of-year non-fiction list, which I really hope to do. In any case, I was so curious to explore more of his work that I picked up 1991's Alma Cogan, and I have to say it hit me with equal force. The novel imagines that the 1950s and early 1960s pop star Alma Cogan did not die young in 1966, but lived on long enough to dwell upon her past, to rummage through the tatters of her lost fame. The prose in the novel is sharp with arresting detail. Byrne focuses so much on the texture of things, the transient clutter that chokes lived realities. The architecture of every sentence is perfectly poised and nuanced in its expression. What truly makes the book, though, is the intense humming of evil that hangs parallel to Cogan's investigation of her own past. The narrative is threaded with fragmentary references to the infamous Moors murders, the horrific slaughter of 5 children around Manchester by Myra Hindley and Ian Brady in the 1960s. These passages often function as interjections or interruptions to the narrative. An account of the comedian Tommy Cooper's last moments on stage is cut short, jarringly. The search for bodies on the moors has been suspended until the weather lifts. It's snowing in the north. Yet here there is no sign of snow. The night sky isn't its usual depthless city black, but lit up with tea scum, coffee scurf clouds of the same pastel spectrum of the inmate's hair. In the period that frames the book's narration, Hindley offered more information about the whereabouts of a number of bodies not yet recovered by police. The book's incredibly subtle but extraordinarily powerful alignment of Cogan's digging in her own past and the simultaneous excavation of the bodies on Saddleworth Moor forges an intimate and unsettling parallel between the worship of celebrity and the prurient, morbid interest in serial murderers, both impulses fostered by the same culture, 2 species of the same spectacle. The twinning of the cult of celebrity and murder fetishism becomes more and more apparent in the book's climax, when the reason for the fusion of Alma Cogan's celebrity and the murders becomes clear. I feel I've scarcely read such an impressive culmination to a novel. Its menacing crescendo will be one that stays with me for a long time, and I envy those who have yet to read it. I've been following Rebecca Gransden's incomparable work for a few years now, and I invariably find myself utterly beguiled by the outlandish atmospheres and dreamscapes she is able to conjure. Her latest work, which came out just this year, is easily my favourite that she's yet published. Figures Crossing the Field Towards the Group calls itself a pilgrimage across an England in delirium. It's an unabashedly obscure novella that is obliquely suggestive in its world-building. The core narrative follows the protagonist Flo across an England in the midst of an indistinct apocalyptic event. She searches for her brother. News is hard to come by. It trickles in from unreliable sources. Towns have been evacuated. Some have made it to the coast. There is something spreading across, or perhaps stalking this land run to ruin. Everyone Flo encounters is mad, in some state of advanced decay or abjection. What makes this book particularly special, however, is the manner in which Flo's arduous pilgrimage across a disintegrating landscape is echoed by the style. Gransden constructs the narrative in almost exclusively monosyllabic prose. To convey what she does within this lipogrammatic restriction is impressive enough, but even more impressive is the parched lyricism that blossoms from this arid terrain. This is particularly apparent in the alien beauty that is conjured through truncated visions of the natural world. Neath a subsol, a range of gold trees set on the flat wide yond, where warmth and peace are bound. Flow strolls sweet grass mid low buzz glow flies, white wings zing in the clear day. Far in the trees there is a scent of earth, and though all is spare to the eye, the air smells full, a mix of fresh wild mess. Spores move round the glen, they catch light to break it inside and burn with god fire. In reading the book, I was reminded of other instances of post-apocalyptic pilgrimage. There are echoes of Ridley Walker, particularly in the gauze of unfamiliarity its language casts over an obliterated England. I found myself thinking of the computer game The Last of Us, especially in the vigour of nature as it reclaims abandoned urban environments. In fact, I once wrote to Rebecca about an earlier book of hers, Sea of Glass. One of her characters seemed to me to carry shades of Silent Hill and the figure of Pyramid Head. It turned out that a computer game had in fact had an influence, though it was Resident Evil's Mr. X that had been an inspiration. I bring up these touchstones not only as points of comparison, but also to emphasize the fact that seeing such influences bleeding into progressive forms of literature is a huge delight to me, and I'd love to see this cross-pollination of media being more widely acknowledged and discussed. I sincerely hope that some of you will check this book out. It was an utterly compelling reading experience. For me, Rebecca Granston is a deeply inventive and unique writer, not content with established modes of expression. Her language is truly her own, and I'm excited to see where it leads her next. I wanted to include a few honourable mentions of books that didn't quite make the list. First, two very well-known books, anything I might have to say about which would be utterly superfluous. I read George Eliot's Middlemarch for the first time this year with enormous pleasure, and I admired the lucidity with which she was able to convey the most minute shifts in mood that her characters experience. And I was also very taken with the grandeur and elegance of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. I also read all of M.R. James's ghost stories in succession for the first time, despite having read most of them many times in the past. I took such delight in this little post-Christmas treat. He remains, in my opinion, the absolute master of the form. Finally, I read The Way by Swans, the first volume of In Search of Lost Time, or Remembrance of Things Past in Moncrief's translation. If I were including it as a standalone book, it would certainly make the list, but I'd love to read the whole cycle before I comment on it in detail. And I think I'll leave the honourable mentions there for now. To go on would press even the most forgiving viewers' patience, I fear. I picked up Mircea Cărtărescu's Solenoid this year with a certain amount of apprehension. It seemed to me that almost everyone around me was absolutely raving about it, and my usual instinct is to turn away from things like that. But this time I'm extraordinarily happy that I gave in to the hype and finally decided to read it. It became one of the most powerful reading experiences of this year, and certainly my favourite piece of fiction. I'll give up any attempts at being comprehensive and simply take a moment to discuss some of the things that I loved so much about it. The first thing to talk about is perhaps its scale and ambition. The book's premise is quite decidedly limited. It follows the inner life of a teacher of Romanian working in a poor district of Bucharest. His reflections on his failure to become a writer, his childhood and upbringing. But what is so impressive about the book is how expansive it feels within these parameters. Surreality bleeds into the mundane until, with a transcendent gaze upon the city, Cărtărescu conjures from 1970s Bucharest a kind of phantasmagoria, just as Bruno Schulz made a dream vision of Dracobert. The city itself is one of the chief characters in the book, and Cărtărescu seems to revel in its dilapidation. Several times he claims that it was never new, but emerged in a state of decay. It is both the saddest city in the world and a kaleidoscopic, hallucinatory and resplendent reflection of the narrator's inner life. It is also apparent that Cărtărescu's imagination has been nourished on the weird and the fantastic. Shades of Lovecraft enter incongruously and magnificently into a world so far removed from them. Decaying buildings become the sites of mystical, often horrific revelations, such as that in the old factory near the narrator's high school.
After no more than 10 meters, the corridor ramified into a labyrinth of rooms and smaller rooms teeming with items on display. Artificially colored biological specimens and hideous creatures in jars with explanatory wall texts celebrating the exobiology of these nightmarish creatures. Monsters that the mind can neither conceive, nor house, nor accept. Not the living dismemberment of cancer, but being buried in a mound of tropical ants. Not being bound to the mouth of a cannon. Not the plucking out of eyes and tongue in a barbaric oubliette. Instead, these were absolute monsters. Monsters of the psyche. Forms made to suffer eternally in the eternal life of the mind, like regret, like remorse, like embarrassment, like dishonor.
Another thing that Solenoid shares with the weird is its emphasis on peripheral states of consciousness, on the borders of perception. Those edgelands of epistemology where certain elusive forms of knowledge appear to hang spectrally just out of frame. This is foregrounded in a number of ways, in the emphasis on hallucinations and dreams, meditations on the fourth dimension and the tesseract, the deciphering of the enigmatic Voynich manuscript, in the preoccupation with microscopic life forms. Solenoid constantly pushes against the limits of the observable world, is desirous to exist in liminal spaces where a materialist worldview breaks down and the fissures spread feverishly across the glassy surface of rationality. Most glorious for me is Solenoid's contribution to an expanded palette of imagery. Nowhere else have I seen such an emphasis on the cellular, the larval, and the microbial. Cărtărescu mines the realms of entomology, botany, and anatomy, and emerges with a rich and unsettling poetic language. The genesis of this is apparent in the narrator's recollection of a childhood encounter with a book of entomology, but it runs like a vermicular seam through the whole text.
When I opened it, minuscule, amber-colored beetles scurried across the pages to hide. But then I found, within the world of the animals that infest your body, devouring you from without and within, a great, somber poem. Not Dante, not Bosch, not even Lautréamont had ever seen, when they imagined their infernos, the bestial face of the louse in close-up, the visage of a larval fly, the flagellate legs of mites. They could not invent, for their subterranean caverns of flames and tears, any demons more terrible than lice and ticks, roundworms and tapeworms, eyeworms, and the blind armies of mites. I saw transparent larvae that entered your brain, rummaging their bristles through your hippocampus that altered your memories and desires. I saw the exuberant appendices, a kind of hand and a kind of knife and a beak like a hypodermic syringe of a parasite that dug tunnels through your eardrums, divisions of worms, minuscule arachnid phalanges, without pity and without the blessing of light, expulsing seas of eggs and oceans of feces, living in our pores and our pulmonary alveoli, invading our sex and nipples at night, with the wet tubes of their stomachs borne on legs with hooks and claws, the quilted, pearly, metallic, or only damp and bloody textures of worms, speckled pink and violet, an infra-world of light and divinity, of devourers and self-devourers, real and beautiful, a world forever damned.
It's been a long time since I was truly so excited about a work of fiction, and it made me deeply curious to explore Cartarescu's work further. I can only say that in this instance it was really worth giving into the hype. As I said at the beginning of this video, it's extraordinarily rare for me to stick to any of my reading plans, but I can't resist engaging in the ritual one more time. I'll try not to be too restrictive. Firstly, there are a few writers whose work I hope to explore for the first time or in greater detail, such as M. John Harrison, Junichiro Tanizaki, and Sylvia Townsend Warner. I'd also like to read a lot more Ian Sinclair. Two upcoming publications excite me particularly: Elfriede Jelinek's The Children of the Dead and the republication of José Donoso's The Obscene Bird of Night. I'm also keen to read more diaries, journals and memoirs, particularly Francis Kilvert's diary. You can also let me know in the comments which publications you're particularly excited about next year. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel or sharing it somewhere online or with a friend. It really helps when new people get to discover the channel. I hope you've had a wonderful reading year and that there's another beautiful one coming up. Merry Christmas to everyone, and thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.